Britain in the 1930s was not always a happy place to be. The country faced economic hardship. Many battled with unprecedented levels of poverty, and the policymakers of the day were preoccupied with one central and crucial question: should Britain rearm her once mighty military ahead of what many believed would be a second Great War with Germany? Yet, despite this ongoing sense of foreboding, the months of 1936 were dominated by a question that seemed almost trivial. The newly installed king, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with the soon-to-be twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, and he was determined to become husband number 3. In this debut season of our brand new podcast, we explore the abdication crisis, attempting to reconstruct events from available source material and solve the many mysteries that surround Britain's most recent royal revolution. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Royal Revolutions. This is Season 1, Episode 3, and we are continuing our series on the abdication crisis of 1936. My name is Gareth Streeter. I am the founder, creator of Royal History Geeks and a history writer, and I am joined by royal commentator and broadcaster James Taylor. James, how are you this morning as we record bright and early?
I'm very well, thank you. But of course, at the moment, we're in the depths of winter. But today we're going to be transported to a golden summer.
Are we?
The summer of 1936.
Oh, I see. Yes,
the summer of love.
The summer, I suppose. Well, it was the summer of love, really. I suppose, wasn't it? I mean, before we get into the depths and the midst of that loving summer, I'm conscious we're now on episode 3 of the series, and we very much said, and I think it's worth us saying this, we haven't necessarily self-identified as experts on this topic, although we're incredibly enthusiastic about it, and we've absolutely reserved the right to learn and reflect as we go. So I was wondering, James, whether you had any specific reflections, either about last week, and hopefully there'll be more time at the end of the podcast to sum up some reflections, but anything you sort of have been thinking about since last week that you wanted to say now about what we've talked about.
Well, I would say that, like we had said before, that our opinions of our two protagonists, it's quite interesting because Edward is not faring terribly well in my estimations, and I guess yours too, whereas Wallis actually comes out a little bit better, and that is in contrast to the typical view that I think that we probably grew up with, that evil Mrs Simpson came to steal the king, and actually he comes across as quite a needy character, quite not very content with his own life, and quite unhappy, quite manipulative in some ways, and she actually comes across as a bit more of a victim than we perhaps have perceived her so far. She's not necessarily the scheming temptress. That's not to say she has no agency. Wallis Simpson had plenty of agency, and she did seek out her life. She was able to seek out certain people that were going to advance her, admittedly, but I think that I have this sort of concern for Wallis, that she's not quite sure of what she's getting into.
I think that's certainly true, and I broadly shared, and we talked about this previously, your views, your kind of transition from, you kind of go into this thinking Wallis is the big bad wolf, and you maybe have got some hesitations about Edward VIII, and as you start to dig into it more, you do get a little bit more sympathy with Wallis, and we'll see, I think, some of the reasons why for that in today's episode. And certainly my opinion of Edward VIII has probably only gone down further. Having said that, whereas last week I was feeling notably more sympathetic, I think, to Wallis, I've been reflecting on that a little bit over the week, partly because the interview that we included last week with Adrian Phillips, which we hadn't actually recorded when we spoke last week, although it was in last week's episode because of the joys of time travel. But I obviously, well, not obviously, but I did speak quite a lot more to him than was featured in that episode. Some of which will be featured in later episodes. But he was gently challenging me a little bit. We may get on to talk about this. I don't want to go through it all now, but he was challenging me a bit to think again about to be a bit more perhaps sympathetic of some of the contemporary sources that are quite critical to Wallis and to highlight that there were very big reasons why the British state didn't even want her as a mistress, let
Mm.
alone as a as a queen, and those
Yeah.
were not just issues of social or society considerations. These were issues of security, and I think
Mm.
that
Mm.
I had perhaps underplayed a little bit, and I just still don't know where I land. But what I have really been reflecting on since last week is, I don't pretend that we approach these topics impartially. And also, I think both you and I are honest about the fact we are both stated partisans of the British monarchy. And there's no point pretending that we therefore can approach everything with a complete impartiality. But I've got so frustrated and angry with Edward VIII as I've looked more particularly at his actions since becoming king and his desire to kind of try and disrupt the system in a way that I think is petulant, childish, and selfish. And I'd be thinking, well, why does that bother me so much? I mean, all systems need reform. All things that you want to survive need modernizing. So why do I resent what may have been from him modernizing gestures? And I think the reason I have that anger is because, and this comes across quite strongly in the in his memoirs, where I think you see a very sort of thin-skinned personality come across. And what he never does is, well, that's not true that he never does. What he rarely does is want to change something by tackling it head on and having an uncomfortable confrontation. So he doesn't say to people, we're changing things, I'm going to watch my own proclamation, or we're going to do business differently. What he does is he just sulks and he's petulant and he just sticks two fingers up at everything and creates disruption. And the reason I think that's so selfish is, we're going to see in this episode that it's raining in July, so he cancels the debutante ball at the last minute. Now, you might think the debutante ball is ridiculous, and I can understand that by the 1930s there might be good reason for
Mm.
that.
Mm.
But as the king, as the head of the system, you can say, right, guys, we're going to review this. Yes, we'll do it this year, but I'm the king. I want to modernize. We're going to change it. Instead, he doesn't do that, and what he does is he just ruins what's a great life moment for a group of young people who are expecting something that he then takes away from them at the last minute rather than tackling it head on. And that's what I don't like. Well, one thing that he does at this stage in mid-year 1936 have some purpose for, as we talked about last week, is there seems to be a clear campaign going on to slowly but surely introduce Wallis Simpson to, well, not to society because she was already introduced to society, but to introduce her as his consort
Yes.
in some form or another. We talked last week about how she'd been present at very formal dinners. She'd been given accorded very high precedence. She'd met with Churchill, who I think Edward had wanted to be a big supporter in his campaign. Churchill had not been a great supporter at that stage. He would later
Mm.
be. And I believe that there was some distancing, perhaps at Wallis's instigation, between Edward and Winston Churchill after this point, because he hadn't given them the reassurances they were seeking. But most significantly, and this is where we left off last episode, is the divorce proceedings between Wallis and Ernest Simpson are now underway. This is not publicly known, but almost certainly key establishment figures would have known, and that would be worrying people. The next item for discussion is the summer of that year in August, as you said, quite literally, the summer of love, where unusually the king decides not to summer at Balmoral, but instead he's going to go on a, to say the word tour is not really appropriate because that suggests some officiality to it, but a voyage, a holiday around the Balkans, sort of Greece, Albania, that sort of part, Turkey, that wonderful part of the world. I mean, this in and of itself is controversial, isn't it? Because the king, that's a very much a Prince of Wales holiday rather than a king holiday, isn't it?
Mm. It is indeed. And if you look, certainly during the reign of the late Queen, she never went on holidays abroad. You know, Princess Margaret was slated for going to
Mm,
Mustique during the winter, but the Queen was very much Sandringham in the winter, Balmoral in the summer. There was very little variation in that pattern. There was the odd visit to Longchamp to go and see horses racing, but that was and I think a private visit to Kentucky, and that was about it.
mm,
There was never this suggestion that she was going out and relaxing on cruises like this Balkan cruise that her uncle
mm.
had been on. And I think that again, it was a very big break with what his parents had done, because although George V and Queen Mary, as Prince and Princess of Wales, had been on several long tours abroad, by the time that he came to the throne after the Delhi Durbar, there were very few visits abroad, either in a public or private capacity. And so it was seen as a great break with the past and break with tradition. Although it has to be said, both Queen Victoria and Edward VII had many private holidays in France, but again were conducted much more privately. They were going to a villa, they were staying there rather than this island hopping.
Look, so as we said, the holiday in of itself is controversial, but I might have some sympathy for the king on that. At the end of the day, it is a private matter. He would still be going to Balmoral for September, where in theory he could do the discharge the functions one would expect the king to discharge at Balmoral in terms of the hospitality and the presence in Scotland. Um, but and he's still a single man in terms of not having a family, and you can
Yeah.
understand how Balmoral is very well suited to a family life holiday.
Mm.
But I think I have some degree of sympathy for him, although of course we must remember that international holidays were much more unusual in the 1930s than I think they are today, and the 80s kind of changed everything with the decade of cheap air travel. So it would have been unusual. But of course, what's much more controversial is the party that he travels with. He is
Yeah.
with what I've called in our notes a fairly libertine group, I would say, of
I think
people
that's a
that.
very polite way of putting it. I think a lot of people would call them loose, or would call them
Yes,
loose, or or any of those
Uh,
slightly pejorative.
and they're not completely inappropriate people. So, for example, you have Duff and Diana Cooper.
Yes.
There, Duff
Yeah.
Cooper is a cabinet minister. Diana has previously been linked to Edward when he was Prince of Wales in some form, but it's actually from Diana Cooper that we get her account
Yeah.
of quite a lot of this trip, and obviously, as ever, to the extent we can trust it, is
Yeah.
difficult to
And of
say.
course, Diana Cooper was a daughter of the Duke of Rutland. She was top
Yes,
drawer
yes, yes, she
aristocracy.
was. Yeah.
So including them, yes, might be slightly odd because they were, Diana Cooper had been a bright young thing,
Mm.
but at the same time, they were of the world that one would have expected the king to have been socialized with.
Absolutely. So that in that sense, they're not actresses and all the rest of it. But of course, the most controversial guest is Wallis Simpson, who accompanies. Now, interestingly, I just sort of assumed I was thinking about this literally just as we are talking. Um, Ernest must have been there as well, wasn't he?
Well, I'm not entirely sure if he was or he wasn't, but I, my guess is that he would have been
I, I
simply
I think he
because the
must have
divorce
been.
hasn't been
Yeah.
announced, and so unless they've put out, the story that he's indisposed in some way, that he's ill or
I,
something like that, I
I'm
think that would
gonna.
be the only way that you would have been able to excuse him not being there, because
Yeah.
at this point, they're still officially married. The divorce is not publicly known, so I think that
I mean, it's
Yeah,
quite the divorce isn't even really in. I mean, it's not just that the divorce hasn't been announced. I mean, they've got all the they haven't done any of the legal proceedings yet.
no,
They've secured the information that they need,
yeah.
i.e., framing Ernest to be in a hotel with, in a compromising position. But there's no that.
In a flagrant, in a, oh, what's the phrase for it? Flagrante delicado.
Yes, so they've done all of that, but there's no sort of there's nothing official with the divorce whatsoever. I mean, we'll check that confirmed next week. I think he must be there, but I just suddenly thought, actually, am I just assuming he was? But either way, whether he was there or not, what's quite interesting about this trip is they're on a big boat. I'm sure they don't call them big boats, do they? They're on a ship,
Yes, a shit.
and
And
from
and do- and do you know what it was called? I think it's quite appropriate what the ship was called, actually.
what was it called?
Nihilin.
What does that mean?
The Nihilin. Well, it ha- well, it comes from the Latin of ex nihilo, out of nothing.
Hmm.
But also it has that connotation of destruction that
Hmm.
something is heading towards.
Right,
That.
right. Oh, that
And
is
so I think that I'm not saying that was deliberate, but it's rather appropriate, I think, for
it
what
is it
was
is
about to happen.
it is rather appropriate. Um, but what's very inappropriate is they Edward and Wallis live as a couple on this voyage. So they're functioning as a couple within their social group, and they're sharing a room. And people know that it's a small party, but people know that. And this is where we get, and we do get it through the prism of Lady Diana Cooper. So it may, I'm afraid I must confess, I know so little about her as to know how reliable. I can't really say how reliable a witness she would be, but we're hearing a lot here about how Wallis, you've got stuff we have heard elsewhere. Edward's behaving very much like a child. Wallis is very much domineering him, humiliating him publicly, which he loves. So this is where we're getting, I think, some of the first. We'd get much more about them as a couple in their later life, but some of the first real supportive evidence of them being functioning in a power dynamic that would have shocked people
Hmm.
that didn't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is I would broadly trust Diana Cooper as a source, because of course her husband did later go on to be ambassador in Paris, and her memoirs of that era as well tend to be better known than this is, because
Mm.
they post-war they received an awful lot of very um, world leaders and lots of very influential people, and so her thoughts on those, while might be slightly indiscreet, are generally in line with what we know of the people that she's talking
Okay.
about. So I would say that she's broadly reliable. That's not to say that she doesn't have her biases. Of course she did, but I would say I broadly trust what she would say.
But what's interesting is, as I understand it, the government, because the government were not massively pleased about this holiday for all the sorts of reasons that all the sorts of reasons one might imagine. But basically, Edward was more or less instructed by the Foreign Office that he would have to do some engagements and meet people if he was out there, because you can't really have um, the king or the king emperor of the United Kingdom of the British Empire just being in the vicinity and not popping in to saying hello to various other dignitaries. So he resented that. But to be fair, he was able to facilitate that, and he had people with him who were perfectly appropriate to be showing off. But there's a really interesting episode which I wanted to talk a little bit about, um, where Edward and the party are having dinner with the King of Greece. Um, and this is fascinating. So it's obviously an informal dinner because the King of Greece brings along his mistress, Mrs. Jones, who's beautiful and young, but married to somebody else. Um, and it's fascinating that at this dinner, Wallis apparently, and this put down as being a very naive question, but sort of quite innocently, asks the king of Greece, well, why don't you just marry her? She's great. What, she could just get divorced and you could get married. And it's
And
apparently this
everybody
just,
could live happily ever
and
after.
everyone could live happily ever after. And it's just an awkward, again, this comes to us from the Coopers, but this awkward moment, and the king sort of has to really explain to her, as they say, like a child, why kings can't just go around um just marrying women who've got another husband living. And it's like, and we talked a bit about this, and I talked a bit about this with Adrian Phillips as well. I think this was in the episode. Wallis seems to be entirely naive as to the controversy that her marrying the king, divorcing her husband and marrying the king, would bring, which partly seems to be down to just a quite a naive view of the world, and it seems secondly to be down to a misunderstanding which may have come from Edward himself as to how powerful the king was.
Yes, I think that both of those things are entirely true. The thing I would say, though, is that Wallis is an intelligent person. So I think that that naivety is not so much because of a lack of intelligence or a lack of being able to. She'd lived in the United Kingdom for several years, and so she knew of the society and the rules within society. She may not have chosen to follow all of them, but I think that it would be naive of us to think that she was completely unaware. But I think sometimes, I think that that combined with, because we've already talked about the powers that Edward wanted to restore to the monarchy, the view that he wanted to have as the King Emperor. And so I think that he had sold her the the idea that he was more powerful than he was in this constitutional state that we had in the
Mm.
1930s. And so I think that she was under that misapprehension, and that was a certain naivety. But that is more understandable because if you have the king, or even when he was Prince of Wales, saying, actually, I have all this power, I can ensure that this happens, and we can get married, and nobody else can do anything about it, they can't stop us, then I think that that being seen through that prism makes that naivety, in light of the fact that she's actually an intelligent person, much more understandable.
What
That's the
is
way
it?
that I would
What
square it.
what what is it that makes you think Wallace is intelligent? Because I'm not. I don't mean this rudely, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how intelligent Wallace was. I mean, and I think again because, and this is the thing I'm revising most about Wallace. And it's not really about character. It's just again, and I've used the Anne Boleyn analogy. I think on every episode we've recorded
Mm.
so far. But I'd always sort of rather naively, having sort of casually known about the abdication crisis, assumed Wallace was this sort of Anne Boleyn figure in terms of being contentious, ambitious, but brilliant. And how could this man was captivated with her, so he gave up everything despite his better judgment, a little bit like Henry VIII seems to have been prepared to do for Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn, without doubt, everybody thinks was this figure of brilliance, whether you see her as
Mm.
sinister or whether you see her as
Yes,
sympathetic. I,
yes.
but actually, the more I've looked at Wallace, there doesn't seem to be examples of sparkling wit in conversations. When you see later interviews with her, there's no great insight. She does, I think, come across as very naive. When an interview later, they're talking about social problems in the world, and she's talking about widows who really have no one to have dinner with them, and they don't get invited to as many social engagements, and it's very clear she has no real experience or understanding of life outside the extreme upper class. I mean, I don't know how intelligent she was. I'm just putting that out there. I'm
Well,
revising as I go, and I reserve the right
yeah.
to change my mind
I mean,
again.
I might be doing her, which I never ever thought I would be saying, but I might be actually being too sympathetic towards her. But I do think that there's a certain, perhaps intelligence is the wrong word, but I think that she's certainly an articulate person. She's not somebody. I don't think she's incredibly stupid. She doesn't come across as somebody who, you know, doesn't. She doesn't come across as somebody who is completely unintelligent. I would put it like that. She seems to have a sort of basic level of intelligence, which you would accept as being, she doesn't come across, probably not as Brain of Britain, but she also doesn't come across as incredibly stupid either.
I get that. I think all I would say is sometimes you get the sense that the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they later become, are these master strategists with a plan to do quite sinister things. And I think they do get themselves involved in some stupid things. But I think that I get much more the sense that they're two quite selfish, headstrong people who blunder about um, without any great strategy or grand vision. But
Yeah.
that's to anticipate a discussion to come. So this trip is covered extensively in the US, and it's difficult. We'll talk in later episodes about Lord Beaverbrook, who's a great media baron, sort of a Rupert Murdoch of the day, although in a way neither of them come out particularly well with that comparison. And he later would be a supporter of Edward and Wallis toward the end of the year. And although it's not that clear from the source material, I think it's reasonably clear that he's already got some involvement with the couple. And he may, because there's later a talk that there's a deliberate attempt in the US to engender sympathy for them as a couple, and I don't know to the extent that that's going on at all. Adrian Phillips has a book about this and looking at sort of the first royal media war, which I haven't read that book yet, but we'll try and read before the end of the series. Um, but what we do know is that Wallis at least seems to be shocked and overwhelmed by the scale of the
Mm.
coverage, which again I think goes back to a point about naivety, which of course she would have been rather clued up upon because she is American, so she will have relatives. Her aunt, of course, is still in the States, who are going to be communicating this to her.
Yes, indeed. And I think it does come as a shock to her, which I think does lend more weight to the idea that it wasn't some great plan, some great scheme, certainly on her part, to be seen with the king, to be able to. I don't go back on what I said before in that it normalizes it and seeing them together, but I do think that the extent to which the coverage and the extent to which it was critical was a surprise to them. I think that they probably expected that that they might be photographed and some people might see it, but not on the scale that it was. And also, I don't think they expected the level of level of debate that came from it. And also, it has to be said that although yes, it wasn't covered in the United Kingdom, it wasn't only in the United States. European newspapers also covered it because we've heard accounts of other members of the aristocracy who were on holiday
Mm,
in, who would say go to the Riviera over the summer and had seen items in newspapers there
mm,
that were shocking. Not shocking because their relationship wasn't known in society, because it was,
mm,
but shocking because to actually see it in print and to see him wearing only a pair of shorts and her in a
mm, mm.
swimming costume and be seen to look quite close and quite intimate. Although when I say intimate, I'm not suggesting that there's any
Yes.
inappropriate level of intimacy, just that it's an intimate setting. That I think that was seen as more shocking because I think that although people were aware that there was a relationship, people in society were aware that there was a relationship between the two, actually seeing how far that relationship has gone is still a shock.
It is, and I think this does see. I mean, it's actually quite difficult to work out because, as we've said, and again, I don't know if we've mentioned this before, but at the moment, just to reiterate for everybody else, there is an unspoken at this stage agreement among the British press not to publish anything about the King's relationship with Mrs Simpson. That would become a more formalised agreement for a few weeks in a few weeks' time from where we're talking about now. But it
Yeah.
seems to have been already an established agreement that they wouldn't, and that as a general rule, they don't talk about the private lives of the royal family. Oh, how times have changed. And Um,
Mm.
but what it does see, so as a result, it's quite difficult to be able to trace when the average bloke or woman in the UK started to become aware of it. Now, I do think this may have been a tipping point because I had said, and I think I said on our bonus episode where we talked to Catherine, that one of the things that took me by surprise was the speed with which the average person would have to have digested this and how they never really would actually ever have any time to digest it because the story breaks in the newspapers on the 3rd of December and he's gone by the 10th. So
Yes,
basically, in a week,
the
it's
week.
all done and
Yeah,
dusted. However, as the more we've been getting into the detail of the research for these episodes, there are signs that it may be more widely known. So around this time, there are apparently government documents about how some people in theatres are refusing to sing "God Save the King"
yeah,
because, and they're stating because of his behaviour with Mrs Simpson. I think around this time, Wallis is starting to get hate mail, which could be US based, but I guess. I mean, it's difficult, James, and you know more than I do probably about the levels of society and how things functioned at this point. But I suppose even though there wasn't a great deal of mixing between, say, people like my grandparents would have been about 9 or 10 at this time, and they would have, stuck up in Barnstaple. They would have had no connections whatsoever to London high
no.
society. But people did have relatives that lived in the US.
Yes. Well, I mean, take my grandparents, very working class background in the Midlands. My granddad was a miner, but he had a sister who works the cook in London and worked
Mm,
for people who were in society, lived in Kensington. And so therefore, I'm not saying I don't know that my grandparents knew anything. I mean, they would have been in their 30s at this time, and my two aunties would have been young children. But it's not impossible that somebody
mm,
who is that there was gossip. I mean,
mm,
certainly people there was leakage, wasn't there? Because people who were in society would have would have personal servants, would not necessarily. Yes, okay, there was a degree that you wouldn't have been quite as open in front of pas de domestique, but that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't this amount of leakage. And certainly, when the King and Mrs Simpson had been welcomed into other people's homes as they
mm,
were, there would have been their servants would have known. They would have. It's not imperceivable that they would have then told their friends, told their relatives. So I think that there would have been a degree of it, and also I think particularly in London, but not so much in the provinces, people would have because they did, for example, go to the theatre or
mm,
go to other places, like nightclubs and things like that. Not, I mean, a lot of their relationship was done behind closed doors in
mm,
palaces or in high society, but they did make not necessarily great public appearances, but went privately to things
mm.
which they would have been seen at. So I think that it's not entirely inconceivable that but again there's a big difference between that sort of nudge nudge wink wink, oh isn't there something going on between the king and that
Yeah.
American woman, and oh actually he wants to marry her. That's where I think the gulf is. I
Uh,
think that you can you can disapprove but accept that something might be going on in his private life that you don't really know a lot about,
mm.
but when it becomes clear that he actually is wanting to introduce this woman to make her queen, that I think is a tipping point where people think actually this is completely unacceptable, and that you can so then you can claim not to have known, but it's not that you didn't know anything was happening, you didn't know that it was this
Well,
serious.
you get a yeah, it could be that in the March you get a letter from a relative and in France or America saying, "Have you heard about the king and this Simpson woman?" And you think, "Oh, what idle tittle tattle from the Continental or the US newspapers? I'll completely ignore that." They write you again in September and say, "Well, did you see this picture of the king and this Simpson woman on a ship, looking very informal. Look at this picture of them," and you think, well, this might still be the papers trying to stir something up, but look at this picture. I find this picture quite shocking,
Yeah,
and people probably were starting in the UK to see these pictures. So I guess it's seeping out, but without a mass
yeah,
media publicity, it wouldn't have had that kind of it wouldn't
No,
be the oxygen people were
no,
breathing.
it wouldn't. And while I'm not suggesting that everybody in the 1930s read the court circular with great attention, nevertheless, Wallis's name did appear quite frequently in the court
Mm,
circular, attending events, which is in a list of other people. I'm not saying that is necessarily significant in itself, but I think that if anybody who looked at it with more than a casual glance would have noticed her name coming up very frequently. And the fact that she is not she has no official position. She's
mm,
not
mm,
married to a government minister. She doesn't have an official position at court. Her husband doesn't have an official position at court.
mm,
So therefore, the fact that this seemingly nobody from nowhere is
mm.
being listed with such regularity, I think ordinary people might, alarm bells might be ringing in as much as who is this woman? Why is she there so often?
But for one reason or another, something is getting too much for Wallis because on the 16th of September, she writes to the king to break everything off. Um, she's saying that we are so awfully congenial and understanding, getting on together very well, but that the possession of beautiful things is thrilling to me, which is quite a backhanded compliment saying I like you because you buy me expensive things and much appreciated, but weighed against a calm and congenial life, I choose the latter. She says she wants to return to Ernest. I have the deepest affection and respect for him. I feel I am better with him than you, and so you must understand. I'm sure that you and I will only create disaster together, which I think is pretty brutal. I think that's pretty
It is.
clear. She doesn't want to
Yeah,
go on.
she doesn't mince her words there, does she?
No. And again, it's not a particularly sophisticated argument, which going back to my thing, if I'm not sure how sophisticated Wallace was,
No,
but the
that,
possession of beautiful things is thrilling to me and much appreciated. But weighed against a calm and congenial life, I choose the latter, saying I really like the expensive stuff
mm,
you buy me, but I'd probably rather have privacy.
yes, and that ties in very well with Diana Mosley wrote a very sympathetic biography of the Duchess of Windsor because they went on to be friends
Mm,
in the post-war period. And it was published in 1980 when the Duchess of Windsor was still alive but was very ill and wasn't able to take any part in society, or it's not even known if she ever was aware that this existed.
mm.
But in this biography of her, which is very sympathetic, it does have this narrative that Wallis had allowed herself to get in too deep. And once she got past a certain point, she realized that she had no alternative but to go along with it and to
Mm.
try and that the rest of her life was just spent trying to make him happy.
Well, I think not so much the second bit, but the first bit that I'd say is quite broadly corroborated by quite a lot of evidence there.
Yeah.
And this is what I think I mean by the naivety of Wallace, in that my read on Wallace up to this point is that she is quite ambitious for her advancement. She is quite ambitious for her wealth, her personal accumulation of wealth. And if you look at her backstory, where she was always the poor relation in a wealthy family, but the poor relation to it, I think you could understand the insecurity of having lots of bills to pay and always being at the beck and call of someone else and having very little agency. So I completely understand that desire to want to accumulate wealth, but she was very interested in that. And there seems to have been, and she quite liked the thought of being queen or
Mm.
married to the king as well and being a royal. But she only seems to have understood the positive side of that, what she saw, hanging out in a palace, wearing lots of nice things. She didn't seem to understand any of the drawbacks of public life, which when you think about the her great rival, who we know as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, she turned down. She only accepted the invitation to marry Prince Albert, the Duke of York, on the third attempt because
Yeah.
she was so mindful of
Yeah.
the strains of being in public life, even in those days, when
Yes.
there was more privacy.
Yeah. And
Uh,
and and we certainly hear the same with Princess Alice, Duchess of Gloucester. She
mm,
was very reluctant. I mean, I don't want to make it sound as though she and Prince Henry didn't have a congenial relationship because they did, but she was a very shy figure, even though she was a duke's
Mm.
daughter, and so she was used to high aristocracy, but at the same time, she knew that being a member of the royal family was still going to, even in a much more sedate era, was still going to be a complete intrusion of one's privacy. And so I think that was again why she was reluctant to marry
Yes.
into the
Uh,
family.
Now, obviously, both of those two, the in the 30s, the Duchess of York and the Duchess of Gloucester, they, as you said, they are from the pinnacle of the nobility, so they are both understandably going to be more aware than Wallis Simpson is
Mm.
as to what royal life was like. But then Wallis wasn't a total newcomer on the scene by any means either. So there's a naivety as to what both the reality of public life would be like, and a naivety which may have been encouraged by Edward around around how easy securing her marriage would be. And she genuinely seems to have had some naivety, and I think the king may have done as well, as to how smooth their path would be. And as it starts to look at that, the other shoe drops basically after August, from what I can see, and she sees A, my life will never be the same again, and B, there's going to be quite a lot of controversy. I think she is starting to get threats of violence at this stage, which must have been awful. She
Yeah.
says, I want out.
And you can't really blame her, can you? I mean, I think that it was just a moment of clarity that everything became clear to her and everything became too much for her.
Yeah. But of course, she does not escape the relationship and figures very close to events
Mm.
believe
Mm.
that one of the reasons for that is Edward said, come and join me in Balmoral now, take back this letter, or I will kill myself.
Mm.
And from here, I think you start to see what I think we will see a great deal of is
Yes.
Wallis, who I think probably was a if I was gonna make a punt now about assessing her character, I'd say she's probably quite a selfish person, but I don't think she's an evil person. Now
Mm.
does realize she can't really abandon the king because
No.
he's dependent on her.
No, and I think that's where that whole narrative of Diana Mosley's book comes
Mm,
there. That she's saying that Wallis spent the rest of her life trying to make him happy, and I think that suggesting that degree of self-sacrifice, and I think that that is true to an extent. I mean, obviously Diana Mosley was very sympathetic towards her,
mm.
and too sympathetic, but I do think there is a grain of truth in that. That once it was, once she'd crossed the Rubicon,
Yeah,
that they were official for want of a better word. Not official, but that it was known.
there was no going back.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
no going back, and therefore that she had to. That she then was. I'm still not saying. I don't buy that she wasn't a selfish person as well, because you can have different facets of your personality and show
Mm.
them in different ways. But I think that there was that. I don't want to say entirely selflessness, because I don't think it was that, but it was a case of, I think there was that understanding that, oh, now I have to devote myself to him.
I think yes, and
I can't
I
entirely go and
I
behave
think
as I choose.
I think some of the later evidence would perhaps call into question whether she fully was doing everything she could to make him happy. But I certainly do think there's this sense that she can't she can't sort of lead him all the way down the garden path and then
No,
leave him there.
no.
And
Well, I mean, the examples that Diana Mosley uses about making him happy are not necessarily that she's doing an awful lot, but just that he likes her to always be there, and she practically always is, and that if she has gone away for the afternoon, she's late back, and
mm,
he's gone,
mm.
oh, where are you? Where is she? Where's the Duchess? When's she coming back? All that sort of thing. And so she has that influence. There's that atmosphere of that she's at his beck and call, and so she's constantly there. And so, but she also is able to charm him in a way that she keeps him happy and keeps him more or less on an even keel. I think that's what she's suggesting, rather than she's going out of her way to do things for him necessarily. It's more her presence and her charm
Uh,
and her wit, and
and,
the
and
sophistication that he sees in her.
And in a sense, we're slightly anticipating conversations that will come in later episodes, but I think it's important because I think we need to look at this stage as to what the relationship was like. But you do have a situation where Wallis, and I'm just sure Wallis knew this before now, that the king is totally obsessed with her. And this is where I think you and me have both talked about a sympathy, an unexpected sympathy that we felt toward Wallis Simpson, because she is locked in and can't really get herself out of a situation. And interestingly, again, this will come up in later episodes, but in the Duke of Windsor's own memoirs, he talks about a later occasion when the abdication crisis is at its height, where Wallis again tries to pull out of it, and he talks about how she can leave if she wants to, but he will follow her to the ends of the earth. There's nowhere
Mm.
that she will go that he
Yeah.
won't follow, and they will be together. And it's presented, and I'm sure entirely massaged by the ghostwriter, and it's presented as this great romantic
Mm.
gesture and this wonderful, we will always be together moment. But you could also read it as bloody sinister in terms of you will not escape me. And for all the she's the powerful one, the dynamic, she humiliates him, I think control works in a number of different ways. And I
Yes.
think he had created a threatening sense of dependency that must have freaked her out.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that I think people are too quick, perhaps to jump to conclusions and use the word abuse these days. But you can certainly see why here there is that sinister feeling of control over somebody. Because if you're constantly threatening that something, that your own life is going to be negatively impacted unless this person is constantly around you, then you can see why that is very claustrophobic.
And I think this is where the sympathy for Wallace comes. So we we have a situation probably where, as I say, I don't think it'd be fair to look at Wallace as a complete victim. I think she went in for the to this relationship with pretty selfish motives. It is possible, although by no means clear, that she may even have initially been intending to blackmail the Prince of Wales as he was then. There is sources that suggest that. I don't think we will ever know the truth of it. She then does spy an opportunity for advancement and she pursues the relationship, perhaps in quite a controlling way, perhaps in quite a manipulative way to get what she wants, with a huge naivety as to A, how hard it will be, and B, what it will be like when she gets there. In after the summer of 36, she has an awakening. She realizes this isn't what she wants. She tries to get out of it, but there is no going back. And it's difficult not to have some sympathy for someone from that point on.
No, and I think that that's where the balance of power has shifted because until this point, she's really held all the cards in that
Mm.
relationship. And while I have more sympathy for her than I imagined, and I do genuinely have that sympathy for her, I think that as well, you mustn't forget that she comes across as a person that isn't entirely, she doesn't come across as an entirely nice person either. And I do realize that we are judging her by sources which are not sympathetic to her a lot of the time. But I still think that she does still come across as quite manipulative and grasping and trying to get what she can out of the relationship, not just in terms of material things, but also in terms of being showered with affection as well as everything else. I don't think that that devotion that he had to her was necessarily completely unwelcome because again, relationships are multifaceted. You can like the fact that somebody is devoted to you, but then still find it claustrophobic at other times. It's
Of
not.
course.
I don't think it's you. I think it's very nuanced. You can't look at one aspect of it and then draw a judgment. I think that she still comes across as somebody who's quite brittle, somebody who's quite acerbic. All of those things. She's not necessarily the nicest person that you would want to see, and so I think that's where it makes it more difficult to have sympathy for her. And also, you do question the extent to which she knew what she was getting. Because yes, you
Mm.
can say she's an American, but she had lived in Britain for quite a while before then. She knew of society. She wasn't entirely naive into going into this. I think she was naive in the sense that she didn't expect the extent to which she faced the amount of publicity that they had abroad at this stage, and
Mm.
also and one must say that those death threats that she had must have been extremely
Mm,
worrying.
mm.
So I think that you can have sympathy for her on that level. But I think you can overplay her naivety. I think my reading of it is that she went into it sort of knowing what she was going to get out of it, but didn't expect all of the ephemera around it.
Mm,
She
mm.
didn't expect the death threat. She didn't expect all of the negative coverage that they got in America. I think that she was naive enough to think that she would go into it and that when it was reported in the American press that everybody was, oh, good on her, American girl, make it's the encapsulation of the American dream in a way, isn't it?
Mm,
That
mm, mm,
that and there's an in quotes ordinary woman from America should even though she's from
mm,
quite a wealthy family, although her side of it's not, but she's from a wealthy family. Then goes off and marries the King of England, and it's a
mm.
love story and all of that. So I think that she was expecting that
Well,
kind of
yeah,
rather
and
than the critical tone that they received.
even though I think Wallis was naive, I have sympathy for her in this situation because how can you possibly know what these things would be like until you're in them?
You can't, and that's the same with most situations in life, isn't it? I mean,
Mm,
no matter who you're going to have a relationship with or who you're going to marry, you can think you know somebody, and then actually they're very different when you see them,
of course.
in the middle of the night, first thing in the morning, all of those things. That they're not necessarily the same as you imagine that they would be.
Anyway, just to move the conversation on a little bit, um, for whatever reason, Wallis does change her mind or has her mind changed for her, who knows? And I think we should just reiterate that certainly among the upper classes, we're living in the telephonic era. So whereas we might see something start a conversation started in a letter, it won't necessarily be continued in letters that survive. Telephones carry on toward the height of the abdication crisis, fears that lines were being tapped, as indeed they were, would mean we have less telephone conversations than we might
And
otherwise.
it,
But
and
at
it
this stage,
certainly and it certainly does become more relevant, doesn't it? When later in the story, which we'll get onto, when Wallis relocates to the continent and they're trying
mm,
to make long distance telephone
yeah,
calls, which at that time were not necessarily easy, and so that added
yes,
another aspect to the communication problems between the two of them.
mm. And somehow or another, between the 16th and 23rd of September, they are reconciled, and um, Wallis travels to Balmoral, the king's, I suppose, would we call it official or semi-official residence in Scotland? It's not. It's an
Well,
established tradition rather
yeah,
than official residence,
it is.
isn't it? But
It's the private residence, Balmoral, but there are certain aspects to the Balmoral stay which are
mm,
public. So even to this day, the king will inspect the guard when he officially takes up residence at Balmoral. But this is later than it used to be. It's around the third week in August now, whereas it used to
mm,
be at the beginning of August. At this time in the 30s, it wouldn't have taken place outside the castle gates it does now because the royal station in Ballater was still open then, and the royal family would tend to travel up by train and would review the guard outside the station before traveling to Balmoral. So that was a tradition. There's also the tradition of attending things like the Highland Games, and also with the Prime Minister staying for the weekend. So all of those are public aspects to what is essentially a private holiday.
and this is where, Edward again looks like he wants to change some traditions, but does so in a reasonably not quite an upfront way, in that he doesn't have a direct confrontation about it, but rather than having cabinet ministers and other people up uh, to do business with him, he instead decides to have a house party for a circle of friends. Of prominent, of course, among them is Wallis. And Edward does two things here, which I think are frustrating. The first, as I said before, is again, he wants to change the tradition. Fine. There are probably quite good reasons for recognizing that trying to do government between London and Balmoral might not be a wonderful thing to do, and certainly some of Victoria's ministers used to get frustrated about the need to trek up to Scotland in a world where that was harder to do than it would be today. Though still quite hard to do today. But
Well, yes,
again,
but having said that, it would have been slightly easier in another way, in the sense that, remember, we're at the zenith of the railways. So
yes,
it would have been easier to get a train in London and go straight to, I don't know whether you could have gone straight to Ballata, but certainly changed in Aberdeen and gone up to Ballata, and then you're only 7 miles away. And so that would have been easier
mm,
yes, it's a long distance, and yes, the journey would have taken longer than it does today, but in the age of steam, but you would still, there were those direct links, which makes it easier than
yes,
perhaps people would think it
that's
would be.
true. That's true. But again, it isn't a case that Edward takes this head on and says, right, guys, we're going to modernize the way we're doing. We're not going to have these trips up to Balmoral, but instead, I recognise this is a constitutional democracy, a constitutional monarchy at the heart of a democracy. You do need time with me, so we'll do it this way instead. We'll have a weekend in Windsor. He doesn't do that. He just snubs them and decides to have a party instead, which is I don't like it when people who are the head of a system act like they're rebels within a system and try and stick two fingers up to it. They want to be the provocateur. No, you're in charge. All right, I guess you're not fully in charge. Of course you're not. But you need to be head on having the difficult conversations about making change. And those changes might not be bad, but you don't do it by just screwing everyone else over and acting like
No.
a child, which is what he
And
was doing here.
and even if he doesn't have the degree of power to which he aspires or thinks he has, the government is still held in his name. And so therefore, if you are then acting in this way, which comes across as rather petulant, then I don't think it reflects well on you.
I just think the contrast between Elizabeth II, and the more I study this, I wonder how, particularly at the beginning of her reign, Elizabeth II was self-conscious. I don't know how much she ever knew, but self-conscious of the reputation of her uncle's behaviour and knew that she needed to be such a counter to that. I don't know, but when you consider,
Well, certainly she based herself on her father, and her father was
mm,
the great counterpoint to her
exactly,
mother. So I
exactly,
think that even if it weren't at the forefront of her mind that she didn't want to be like her uncle, I think that she did want to be
mm.
very much like her father, very much the dutiful mother. And so I think that that was probably the predominant
Mm.
thought.
But when you think, and I know there's a hauntingly similar comparison, because when you think of Elizabeth II, the day before her death, um,
Mm,
hosting hosting ministers in Balmoral for the
yeah.
changeover prime minister, because she knew she was literally on her deathbed. She's like, no, this duty comes first.
Mm,
The change, the monarch appointing the new prime minister, receiving the resignation of the outgoing, appointing the new one is the fundamentals of constitutional monarchy. I will, yes, all right, she made them go to Balmoral, whereas normally it would be Buckingham Palace. But she's like, I will do this. I will fulfill my duty to the
mm,
country. And you've got Edward, who won't even just have them up for a weekend because he wants a
no,
party.
no,
And you just think, oh, come on.
yeah. And one thing I will say, which is digressing a little, I was lucky enough this year to go on one of the first public tours of Balmoral Castle, the interior of Balmoral Castle. And as part of that,
Mm,
we actually went into the room where the Queen received the outgoing and incoming prime
mm,
ministers shortly before her death. And that was really quite a surreal and quite emotional
mm,
moment. And,
mm.
and just saying it, actually, I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck starting on.
Yeah, yeah.
You really felt her presence there. And that, as you say, that sense of duty that she was there to do. And also, you can't help but standing in that room and have that picture of her in your mind, of her looking very frail, but still reassuringly smiling, and
Mm.
the show's going on. And that stayed with me. And I think that when we think of Elizabeth II, we think of her as being very dutiful, which is in complete contrast to her uncle, who we think is
Mm.
being much more hedonistic.
The other major and much more public faux pas, and I say faux pas because I shouldn't say faux pas, because faux pas suggests that it's not a calculated decision. And I think it was certainly a conscious decision. But the king pulls out of an event opening Aberdeen Hospital,
Hmm.
and the Duke and Duchess of York pick it up instead because he has decided to go and collect Wallis from Aberdeen Station. He wants to
Yes,
drive to pick her
yes.
up. And again, the sort of height of the height of selfishness when you consider how excited people would have been about the king
Mm.
coming. Now, for all kinds of reasons, events need to be cancelled. These things do happen, but you just think again, and also the shock factor for those that did know, and it seems that some people did, that that's what he'd gone to do is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's one thing for, I mean, for example, I was recently at the Field of Remembrance at Westminster Abbey, and the Queen, Queen Camilla, was due to be there, but she was ill. And so the Duchess of Gloucester took her
Mm,
place. And most people were just thrilled that a member of the royal family was
mm,
there. I was thrilled because you don't normally see the Duchess of Gloucester at that event. And I thought, well, this is
mm.
going to be a unique occasion. Um, but there were some people who were there saying, "Oh, what have they sent her for? She's not very high up in the line
Mm,
of
mm.
success." You know, well, she's not actually in the line of succession, but this was the phrase that the
Yes,
person used
yeah.
before anybody castigates me. But yeah, and so I can understand why people would have been disappointed that the Duke and Duchess of York were there. Of course, it has to be remembered that they were holidaying at Birk Hall, their home on the Balmoral estate at the time,
Right.
and so therefore they were on hand. But it's one thing for to be disappointed because the king is indisposed in the same way that Queen
Yeah.
Camilla was a few weeks ago, and the other members of the royal family are going to represent him. But when it's the fact that the Duke and Duchess of York are carrying out an engagement to open Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, and yet the king is seen in the
Mm.
same city
Yes, yes, yeah.
at the same time that this event is taking place, you do kind of think, could he not have carried out the engagement? Could the engagement,
Mm,
even if they had to reschedule the time of the engagement, which it would be a great inconvenience for a lot of people,
mm.
but I'm sure if it had been done in the right way, could have been managed, or couldn't Wallis have, got a later train or
Well,
something like
this is what I
that?
was going to ask you
There's
actually,
any
is
number of
how regular were trains then? Would it have been possible to get a later
Uh,
train
I'd have to
logistically?
look it up. I would really have to look it up to know exactly, but they did run regularly.
Yeah,
I mean,
it wasn't like one a day or anything then.
no, no, certainly not to Aberdeen. To Ballater, which is the smaller station
Mm,
that was near Balmoral that was closed in the 60s. That well, even they were fairly frequent, but not as frequent. But yes, no, they were fairly frequent services between certainly London and Edinburgh, and yes, London and
mm.
Aberdeen. And there were named expresses that ran several times every day.
Right,
Quite
right.
very, and certainly at this particular time, because you'd had the Silver Jubilee in 1935, both the LNER and the LMS, the railway companies, had introduced at great expense, new luxury carriages, and you've got
Mm,
the
mm,
new locomotives coming in. So you had the A4 class on the East Coast Main Line, which Mallard went on to break the record for steam, and
mm.
on the LMS you had the Princess Coronation class locomotives and the Princess Royal locomotives. They were all introduced at this time, and because of these crack expresses. So no, there was a frequent service. I would have to look at exactly how many went to
No,
Aberdeen,
that's but
but
it, but it's not
it's the
unbelievable to think they
yeah
could have somehow
yeah
negotiated a scenario where the king did open Aberdeen Hospital and collected Wallace at a different time that day. I mean, who knows? We're not obviously going to know of all the
no.
logistics as
And
why that
and
may or may
also
not have been
and also
possible.
it's also not impossible that even if there were only the one train per day, that she could have not have been entertained by one of the king's associates in the station master's office or another private
Yes,
area
yeah, yeah.
until the king came to receive her. Because if you look certainly in the early period when he's Prince of Wales, when he used to go regularly to hunt in Leicestershire, that on occasion he was forced to change his clothes in from the gear that he travelled into his hunting
Mm.
outfit in the station master's office at Corn. So
Right, right.
it would not have been impossible to have arranged that. And I think as well, again, we're back to this whole thing about disappointing people, because we looked at the issue with the debutantes earlier. I mean, the whole reason that the fact that it was raining was an issue for the debutantes was because the king had changed it in the first place from a
Mm.
ball in the evening to being an afternoon reception in the garden at the palace.
Yes, actually, we
And
didn't
so,
talk. I mentioned that, but we didn't talk about this, did we? But yes, the king
no,
did.
yes, and so again, so one could argue that that was partly his own fault because he had not because he wanted it as an outdoor event, but also it wasn't inconceivable that you could have rearranged it for another date or time, but no, he didn't. And again, here, rather than looking to rearrange the opening of the hospital either on the same date at a different time or on a different date, what happens? He pulls out
Mm.
altogether. Yes, admittedly, he sends the York, so people are not entirely disappointed, but I think that it's still it still shows a lack of willingness on his part
Well, it
to.
it does, and it's just complete disregard. And I get it. I mean, I think so. I think we'll get criticism for what we said about the debutante ball, and I understand why. Look, I do understand. And just to give context, because we've sort of talked around this, but I'm not quite sure we've actually said it. But basically, because of because of the weather, the king reasonably well at the last minute, more or less, cancels the debutante ball in that summer, which would have been his first one as king, and that's where the ladies of the highest bits of high society, young ladies, would come. They'd be presented to the king. That would be a fish. That would be their transition from girlhood to womanhood. They're then available for quarters to seek their hand in marriage, and it was an important part of how that aspect of society worked. We are not saying that we think disregarding a debutante is a great social ill or something that should be thought of. There are probably indeed it would only be 20 odd years later when Elizabeth II decides that the debutante ball has had its day and decides to pull the plug on it. But the point we're trying to make, I think, is that when she did that, she did it in an ordered, considered, head-on way where she had the right conversations as it was managed. She didn't just decide at the last minute she could be bothered and pull out of it,
No,
and to just pull
no,
the plug on people almost mid
yeah,
ceremony is what
and it was
annoys me.
no, because it was announced in public, and also they announced that they would hold an extra garden party at the palace to
Mm,
invite more people. I mean, one can argue about how democratic that is, but that they would invite more people to, and also that's when they introduced having people who are prominent in industry
mm.
to have a private lunch at the palace with the late Queen and Prince Philip. So those innovations were going on at the same time. It was removing something but replacing it with with something that was seen as more democratic and was seen as being less about getting girls on the marriage market. And of course, Princess Margaret was later heard to say, wasn't she, that every
Yeah.
tart in London was being presented, so that was the reason it had to go.
Mm.
But and one last point about Edward the Eighth and the debutantes is that there are pictures of him holding later debutante afternoon parties rather than balls at the palace in the garden. And it was remarked at the time, and certainly looking at pictures and looking at footage of it, he does look incredibly bored
Mm.
to be there. And I
I
realised
get
that,
that. I'd find it really boring. I
yes,
do get that,
well, I'm
but
not
when you're
saying
the
I
king,
wouldn't. I'm not saying I wouldn't,
oh,
but I think I would.
you'd love it.
Well, I'd get a bit fed up of
You would not.
the
You'd
constant
love
stream.
it.
But no, but even if I were completely bored, I like to think that I would have had the grace to put on a good public face.
Yes, I mean it's like some of the things the Elizabeth II, well, all the contemporary royals have to go to. They've got no interest in, but they have to smile along and no, I completely agree. I mean, I think, and I'm going to make this point for the third time as to why I think it riles me. So I'm sorry if I'm being repetitive, but I don't know how much I'm going to edit out. But I don't like it when people who have the ability to lead and make change, even though it will require a bit of flack and a bit of confrontation and a bit of pain, when they choose instead to avoid doing that and then act as if they're a rebel within the system and act in a petulant way, because I think that is a complete abdication of their responsibility and it cheapens the point they're trying to make.
And
That's all I'll say.
an abdication of their responsibility. How
Oh,
appropriate on
quite.
this.
Quite. Anyway, so it seems that from this point, and we're about to see why, there now are concrete rumours circulating that the King and Wallis are going to marry. And this is no doubt precipitated by the fact that Wallis, and I don't have an exact date, but in October, Wallis officially files for divorce in a court in Ipswich. I believe there was some belief that Ipswich, being a bit far from London, might receive less media scrutiny, which I don't think turned out to be the case
Yeah,
internationally.
they planned that one well.
Quite. But
Yes,
also, I think they believed that, frankly, there were just less cases, so it would get heard a bit more, and they had reason to believe, not entirely correctly, that they may have a sympathetic judge. But as I understand it, Wallis um, had to move. She had to relocate to Ipswich to actually basically get a flat in Ipswich
yeah.
for a few weeks, so that she was resident of the area and could appropriately file for divorce within it. She was none too happy, as I understand it, about that, what she may have seen as, now, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to anyone who hails from Ipswich, but she saw that as not necessarily the place she would want to spend a lot of time.
No, well, I think she just viewed it as provincial, didn't she? And a
Yeah.
bit of a dull backwater, which uh, she had, but seemed to have that same view of place. I mean, she was not keen, not that she had much opportunity while he was king, but certainly there was that view of Sandringham as being, and even Balmoral as being, out of it. She was much more of a cosmopolitan and
Mm.
an urban person, I think it's fair to say.
And Ipswich did not deliver for her in that sense.
No.
No. But with all this happening, unsurprisingly, people are now cottoning on to exactly what's happening, which has, of course, been a fear people have had for some time, that this has crept up a notch. The King and Wallis are now intending to marry. And as a result, on the 20th of October, Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, he requests to see the King. And I think we should pause there in terms of going through the narrative, because next episode we'll look particularly at the fallout between the government and the King over the abdication crisis. The week after, we'll look a bit more at the King's fight back and his supporters. But that will be where we'll get into detail. So we'll pause there on the cliff edge that Stanley Baldwin has asked to see the King. Now
But we've passed the point of no return.
We've passed the point of no return, or have we? And that will be thrown up. And I think it's just worth saying, we're now at the 20th of October. What we know, spoiler alert, is that on the 10th of December, the King will sign the instrument of abdication. So we're going to have, over the next couple of episodes, an awful lot of stuff happening very quickly. And we're going to try and chart through things as quickly as we can. And there will be a few occasions where people say, hang on a minute, that doesn't quite make sense. And it doesn't make sense to us either. And the main reason for that is because human beings don't make sense. And people, particularly when they're reacting quickly, don't think or act entirely consistently or in a clear straight line trajectory. And that will be interesting to unpack. Okay, so everyone, we shall leave it there for this week. We had been thinking that there wouldn't be that much in terms of core events to talk about. So we'd spend a good chunk of this episode reflecting on Wallis, Edward, who we think they were, also, if you like, mid-season reflections and what they were up to. I think we have done that during the course of that. We've just done it as we were going along, rather than in a bunch at the end. But I think that should work quite well. So I hope you're enjoying that. I hope you're finding this as fascinating as we are. Do come back. I should say as well, in terms of our recording schedule, we're recording this episode, well, it's currently the 19th of December. This episode should drop probably a bit earlier in the week than probably on the 23rd, before I shut down for Christmas. We're not recording anything next week. We're having a break. We will be recording the week after, which means the podcast should be back on the 7th of January. So thank you for joining the fun. Have a fantastic Christmas and a happy new year, and we will see you in 2025.
Goodbye.
Royal Revolutions is a Royal History Geeks podcast. For more information about our other podcasts, head to royalhistorygeeks.com/podcasts. The Royal History Geeks community is active across Facebook, X, YouTube, Instagram, and Discord. Just search for Royal History Geeks on your social platform of choice, and you should find us there. The first episode of Royal Revolutions dropped in December 2024. The entire first season will focus on the abdication crisis. Toward the end of season 1, we will devote an entire episode to questions, so please get in touch with us via our socials or at royalhistorygeeks@gmail.com to send any questions about the abdication crisis our way.